The teaching of the tradition. The teaching of Donum Veritatis is not some modern novelty. It has precedence in St. Paul's correction of St. Peter, in Pope Innocent III's statement that he could legitimately be judged on account of a sin committed against the faith, and in the correction of Pope John XXII by the theologians of his day. It has also been given expression over the centuries by several saints and approved theologians. St. Thomas Aquinas' teaching on the subject in Summa Theologiae is worth quoting at length. Fraternal correction is a work of mercy. Therefore, even prelates ought to be corrected. A subject is not competent to administer to his prelate the correction which is an act of justice through the coercive nature of punishment. But the fraternal correction, which is an act of charity, is within the competency of everyone in respect of any person towards whom he is bound by charity, provided there be something in that person which requires correction. Since, however, a virtuous act needs to be moderated by due circumstances, it follows that when a subject corrects his prelate, he ought to do so in a becoming manner, not with impudence and harshness, but with gentleness and respect. It would seem that a subject touches his prelate inordinately when he upbraids him with insolence, as also when he speaks ill of him. To withstand anyone in public exceeds the mode of fraternal correction, and so Paul would not have withstood Peter then, unless he were in some way his equal as regards the defense of the faith. But one who is not an equal can reprove privately and respectfully. It must be observed, however, that if the faith were endangered, a subject ought to rebuke his prelate even publicly. Hence Paul, who was Peter's subject, rebuked him in public, on account of the imminent danger of scandal concerning faith, and, as the gloss of Augustine says on Galatians 2:11, Peter gave an example to superiors that if at any time they should happen to stray from the straight path, they should not disdain to be reproved by their subjects. To presume oneself to be simply better than one's prelate would seem to savor of presumptuous pride. But there is no presumption in thinking oneself better in some respect, because in this life no man is without some fault. We must also remember that when a man reproves his prelate charitably, it does not follow that he thinks himself any better, but merely that he offers his help to one who, being in the higher position among you, is therefore in greater danger, as Augustine observes in his rule quoted above. End quote. Similarly, when discussing Paul's rebuke of Peter in his commentary on Galatians, Aquinas says that this rebuke was just and useful, because of the danger to the gospel teaching, and that the manner of the rebuke was fitting, that is, public and plain, because Peter's dissimulation posed a danger to all. Aquinas observes, "Therefore, from the foregoing we have an example. To prelates, indeed, an example of humility, that they not disdain corrections from those who are lower and subject to them. To subjects, an example of zeal and freedom, that they fear not to correct their prelates, particularly if their crime is public and verges upon danger to the multitude." End quote. Several aspects of Aquinas' teaching here merit emphasis, because they correct a number of misunderstandings that are common in Catholic circles. First, a Catholic can correct a prelate, that is, someone with ecclesiastical authority, such as a bishop. Some Catholics falsely suppose otherwise, on the grounds that a subject has no authority over a prelate. But as Aquinas points out, what a subject lacks is authority to secure justice by punishing a prelate for wrongdoing. Only a superior can do that. That does not entail that a subject cannot criticize a prelate. So long as the prelate really is guilty of wrongdoing, the criticism is respectful, and the subject is acting out of charity, rather than pretending to exercise authority over the prelate. Aquinas even says that the scriptural account of Paul rebuking Peter was meant precisely as an example of zeal and freedom to Christians, so that they would fear not to correct their prelates. Second, the Pope is among those who can be corrected in this way. This is obvious from the fact that Aquinas is speaking of prelates in general, and the Pope is a prelate. Furthermore, the example of correction Aquinas cites is Paul's correction of Peter, and Peter was a pope. The fact that the Pope has no superior on earth is irrelevant, because again, what is in view here is not a subject punishing a pope so as to secure justice, which no subject of the Pope may do, but rather merely respectfully criticizing a pope out of charity. Third, Aquinas is clear that while such correction of a prelate should in the ordinary case take place privately, there are also cases where it can and should be done publicly. Specifically, Aquinas says that public rebuke of a prelate would be called for if the faith were endangered, or if his crime is public and verges upon danger to the multitude. Fourth, Another reason such correction of a prelate can be called for is for the sake of the prelate himself. If a pope is guilty of serious error and of leading others into error, one does not show greater piety or loyalty to him by pretending otherwise. On the contrary, one contributes to endangering his soul. For precisely because of his greater responsibility, he is in greater danger spiritually, as Aquinas, following Augustine, puts it. One of the things a prelate is in greater danger of is arrogance, so that, as Aquinas says, correction from a subordinate can help a prelate to develop humility. Fifth, Aquinas' remarks show that it is silly to accuse those who criticize a prelate of necessarily thinking themselves more Catholic than the Pope. For one thing, as Aquinas says, when a Catholic criticizes a prelate, it does not follow that he thinks himself any better, but merely that he offers his help. For another, a Catholic who criticizes a pope or other prelate might in fact be better in some respect. As Aquinas writes, there is no presumption in thinking oneself better in some respect, because in this life no man is without some fault. The theologians who criticized Pope John XXII for his theological errors were in fact better than him with respect to their understanding of the specific theological matter at issue. The Catholics of Pope Urban VI's day, who criticized him for his arrogance and foolish policies, were in fact better than him with respect to their wisdom vis-a-vis policy. Catholics who condemn the immoral personal lives that a number of popes of the past have had are in fact better than those popes with respect to their personal moral virtue, and so on. Sixth, it cannot be emphasized too strongly that, as Aquinas notes, criticism of a prelate must be carried out with gentleness and respect, and not with impudence or insolence. Sometimes Catholics who raise legitimate criticisms of a pope publicly treat him with the sort of contempt and flippancy with which radio hosts and comedians typically treat politicians and other public figures in modern liberal democracies. This is gravely wrong. Even when your father is in error and must be rebuked, he is still your father, and the fourth commandment is still in force. You may not belittle him or treat him as if he were some flunky. Now, the Pope is a spiritual father, and more than that, he is the vicar of Christ. His subjects must always act in a way consistent with the high dignity of his office, even when he is not living up to the demands of that office. That does not mean that in evaluating the problematic words and actions of a pope, we must deny harsh truths. For example, it is not disrespectful or insolent to judge that Pope Honorius abetted heresy, or that Pope Stephen VI was insane, or that Pope Urban VI was foolish, or that Popes John XXII and Benedict IX lived evil lives. These are simply straightforward, factual judgments based on evidence. The point is that the legitimacy of criticism of a pope under certain circumstances has nothing whatsoever to do with the modern liberal individualist mentality of treating authority with contempt, celebrating the rebel and the dissident, etc. Indeed, legitimate criticism of a pope is essentially a matter of upholding his authority by helping him better to fulfill the purpose of his office, namely, passing on the deposit of faith and teaching it to his spiritual children. The aim is to urge him to be more pope-like, more father-like, not less. The key is to keep in mind that the papacy has a teleology, or final cause. The pope is not an absolute monarch, and must not proclaim his own ideas, to quote Benedict XVI again, but rather must religiously guard and faithfully expound the deposit of faith, as Vatican I put it, teaching only what has been handed on, guarding it scrupulously and explaining it faithfully, as Vatican II says. To the extent that a pope fails to do this, he is like a father who misleads his children. Now, just as it would be perverse to defend an abusive father's actions in the name of fatherhood, so too would it be perverse to defend an errant pope's actions in the name of papal authority. As the eminent 16th century Dominican theologian Melchior Cano put it, Peter has no need of our lies or flattery. Those who blindly and indiscriminately defend every decision of the Supreme Pontiff are the very ones who do most to undermine the authority of the Holy See. They destroy instead of strengthening its foundations. At the same time, just as it would be perverse to pretend that one is upholding fatherhood by mocking and abusing an errant father, so too would it be perverse to pretend to be upholding papal authority by criticizing a pope in a disrespectful manner. The teleology of fatherhood shows both that a father can be criticized under certain circumstances, but also how such criticism must be conducted. Something similar is true of the papacy. Its final cause is to function as a doctrinal authority. To acquiesce in papal error would undermine the doctrinal part of this function, but to reprove error in an impotent manner would undermine the authority part of the function. As the quote from Cano indicates, Aquinas is by no means the only thinker in the tradition to recognize that there can be cases when a pope should not be followed. Cardinal John Henry Newman speculated about the possibility of extreme cases in which conscience may come into collision with the word of a pope, and is to be followed in spite of that word, though he judged such cases to be very rare. In support, Newman cites remarks from St. Robert Bellarmine and Cardinal John de Torquemada. Cardinal Torquemada wrote, "Although it clearly follows from the circumstance that the Pope can err at times, and command things which must not be done, that we are not to be simply obedient to him in all things, that does not show that he must not be obeyed by all when his commands are good. To know in what cases he is to be obeyed and in what not, it is said in the Acts of the Apostles, 'One ought to obey God rather than man.' Therefore, were the Pope to command anything against Holy Scripture, or the articles of faith, or the truth of the sacraments, or the commands of the natural or divine law, he ought not to be obeyed, but in such commands to be passed over." And Bellarmine taught, "As it is lawful to resist the Pope if he assaulted a man's person, so it is lawful to resist him if he assaulted souls, or troubled the state, and much more if he strove to destroy the Church. It is lawful, I say, to resist him by not doing what he commands, and hindering the execution of his will." We find similar remarks from other eminent theologians and churchmen of the past. For example, Cardinal Cajetan held that in dealing with a pope who abuses his office, Catholics can legitimately oppose the abuse of power which destroys by suitable remedies such as not obeying, not being servile in the face of evil actions, not keeping silence, and by arguing. Similarly, Cardinal Raphael Mary del Val wrote, "Great as our filial duty of reverence is towards whatever the Pope may say, great as our duty of obedience must be to the guidance of the chief shepherd, we do not hold that every word of his is infallible, or that he must always be right. Even today a bishop might expostulate with the Pope, who in his judgment might be acting in a way which was liable to mislead those under his own charge, and then write to his critics that he had not hesitated to pass strictures upon the action of the successor of St. Peter. The hypothesis is quite conceivable, and in no way destroys or diminishes the supremacy of the Pope, and yet an individual bishop does not occupy the exceptional position of St. Paul, a fellow apostle of the Prince of the Apostles. Even a humble nun, St. Catherine of Siena, expostulated with the reigning pontiff in her day, whilst full acknowledging all his great prerogatives. The case of Pope Francis. I hardly need point out that these considerations have contemporary relevance. Pope Francis has made statements that at least appear to conflict with traditional Catholic teaching on Holy Communion for divorced and remarried Catholics and non-Catholics, contraception, capital punishment, the criteria for the validity of a marriage, and other topics. He has also studiously refused to respond even to polite requests for clarification and reaffirmation of traditional teaching on these subjects. For these statements, he has been respectfully criticized by many prominent Catholic churchmen, philosophers, and theologians with long-standing reputations for fidelity to the magisterium. There have also been petitions such as the Statement of the 45 Theologians, the Filial Correction issued by 62 theologians and priests, the Pastoral Appeal from priests to their bishops to address the current crisis, and, of course, the Dubia issued by 4 of the cardinals mentioned above. The Pope's own former head of the CDF, Cardinal Gerhard Müller, has also been critical of an absence of theological rigor under Francis's pontificate, the Pope's manner of dealing with subordinates, and a general climate of fear he says exists in the Curia. For so many prominent faithful Catholics, publicly to criticize a Pope seems unprecedented, though perhaps the criticism Pope John XXII faced from the theologians of his day was somewhat similar. However, for a pope to make so many problematic statements while persistently ignoring repeated respectful requests for clarification is certainly unprecedented. Hence the criticism is not surprising. More to the present point, It is manifest from Donum Veritatis, canon law, and the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas and other approved theologians, that the criticism is clearly within the bounds of what the Church permits. Those who accuse these critics of being dissenters or disloyal to the Holy Father are either being intellectually dishonest or simply don't know what they are talking about. Moreover, the legitimacy of this criticism is clear even from the teaching of Pope Francis himself. For one thing, the Pope has explicitly said that some of his public remarks are open to legitimate criticism. For another, in his recent exhortation Gaudete et Exultate, Pope Francis asserts that doctrine, or better, our understanding and expression of it, is not a closed system, devoid of the dynamic capacity to pose questions, doubts, inquiries. Now, in my opinion, this statement needs serious qualification. But if Pope Francis believes that a Catholic can legitimately pose questions, doubts, inquiries about doctrines that have for millennia been consistently taught by Scripture, the fathers and doctors of the Church, and all previous popes, then he cannot consistently deny that it can be legitimate to pose questions, doubts, inquiries about statements of his own that seem inconsistent with those doctrines.